Let's be clear. What happened to George Floyd is a horrific act of police brutality. This should never have happened, and we must ensure that it never happens here in Texas. I join the millions of Americans who seek swift justice in this case. George Floyd's death has touched every corner of our country. People are rightfully angry. But the beautiful thing about America is that every person has the right to make their voices heard, to protest against this injustice. However, violence and vandalism is never the answer, and they have no place in Dallas, Fort Worth, or anywhere in the state of Texas. You know, ironically, those acts of violence and vandalism, they are overshadowing the death of George Floyd, rather than shining a light on the injustice that occurred. They drown out the voices of those who are seeking to protest peacefully. In response, Texas is working with local law enforcement to maintain order and to uphold public safety so that peaceful protesters can make their voices heard. To that end, it is essential that we end the violence, the vandalism, and the looting that we've seen over the past few days during the course of these protests. That is why we have deployed more than 1,000 Department of Public Safety officers, as well as hundreds of Texas National Guard, just to the Dallas-Fort Worth region alone. More are being deployed across the entire state of Texas. We are also working with our partners in the U.S. Attorney's Office as well as the FBI to quell any uprisings of violence that may occur. Now, some of the violence that we're seeing is not being done by people who reside in Dallas or even in Texas. Instead, the violence is coming into Texas from across state lines. It's committed by criminals who are hijacking peaceful protests in order to plunder and in order to loot. That is why we are also working with all 4 United States attorneys in Texas to ensure that these criminals are going to be subject to federal prosecution. Our immediate task at hand is to ensure that we restore calm in our communities, but restoring calm in our communities does not end our task. Our work will not end until justice, fairness, and equality become a reality in every part of our great state. And Texas is up to this task. Texas is recognized as a national leader in criminal justice reform. Texas passed the Timothy Cole Act, the Sandra Bland Act, and the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act. I signed a law that places body cameras on law enforcement uniforms to make a record of all police encounters. I signed into law the Timothy Cole Exoneration Review Commission. The Innocence Project, which is known across the United States, perhaps across the entire world, they labeled Texas the gold standard in innocence reform. And Texas has exonerated more individuals than any other state since 1989. We are up to the task of doing both, correcting injustices and restoring safety in our communities. What I have seen as governor is that Texans can overcome any challenge. We can put an end to the violence that is gripping our cities. We can remedy the injustices that have plagued African American and other minority communities in Texas. And we will seize this moment to bridge the divides that exist in our state so that we can and we will keep Texas the greatest state in the United States of America. At this time, I will pass it to Mayor Eric Johnson.
Thank you, Governor Abbott. I want to say that, first of all, I appreciate your words and your support. And I also want to thank Mayor Price and her team for joining us here today. I want to echo the governor's statement about George Floyd. What happened in Minneapolis was brutal, inexcusable, and tragic. And Mr. Floyd's death reopened a painful wound that runs deep in our city, our state, and our country. It's a wound, however, that will not heal on its own. The city of Dallas has and must continue to address our challenges head on. As you all know, I love this city. I grew up right here in West Dallas and Oak Cliff, and it's the only city that I've ever called or ever wanted to call home. I'm proud to be a Dallasite, a Texan, and an American, and I'm honored to serve as the mayor of my hometown. No one goes into public service because they believe everything is perfect and every problem has already been solved. I grew up surrounded by inequities in historically underserved communities in this city. While those of us up here haven't always agreed on every issue, we all dedicated ourselves to public service because we want to improve the lives of our neighbors in our community. And our community right now is expressing legitimate concerns, fears, and complaints about a history of systemic issues in this country. We should hear them, we should talk to them, and we should respect them and their rights to express themselves. It's up to us, the public officials up here, and all of us who are watching and listening, to heed these calls for justice. On Friday, we will have a special called meeting of the Dallas City Council to discuss the events of the past week and to talk about what this city can do better. In the meantime, I want to reiterate that we will not tolerate those who want to come into our city and exploit these peaceful protests to cause mischief for its own sake or for their own personal gain. The violence, vandalism, and theft that we saw committed by some groups of people over the weekend is not reflective of the city that I know. And much of it was perpetrated by people who are not residents of the city of Dallas. They don't pay taxes here. It's not their property they're destroying. This isn't their home. These are outsiders who came into our city to cause trouble knowing that they don't have to live with any of the consequences. I am very grateful to Governor Abbott for the additional resources he's provided to help maintain order and to allow for peaceful protests to go on without disruption. And I'm also thankful for the people of the city of Dallas who've been overwhelmingly supportive and have heeded our calls for peace. Our people have been through extraordinarily difficult times in the past few months. The ongoing pandemic, the economic turmoil, and the unrest of the past few days have been heartbreaking to watch unfold in our great city. We're doing all that we can to help our residents get through these difficult times. As usual, our people are responding with dignity and with grace. They're helping each other out, and that's how we're going to get through this together. So thank you, Governor, and may God bless the city of Dallas, the state of Texas, and the United States of America. And now I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, the Mayor of Fort Worth, Betsy Price.
Thank you, Eric, or Mayor Johnson. It's hard sometimes not to call your good friends by their first name, but we appreciate you hosting us today. Governor Abbott, thank you for joining us here in Fort Worth, Dallas region today. As we all deal with really difficult issues, and I want to thank Mayor Johnson and Chief Hall for their support in this. We live in a very regional area. People go back and forth, so we are heavily dependent on each other, and our citizens are often Eric's citizens during the day and vice versa for all of us. It really is intertwined. Our own Chief Ed Krause is with us today. The protests continued last night in Fort Worth despite the fact that we had the curfew, by and large peaceful, and our chief and our officers and joined with our protesters in compassion, love, and some sharing of friendship. It was incredibly moving last night to watch the images of our chief kneeling and praying alongside the protesters, of him moving the SWAT team back on the promise that they would leave. Oftentimes, it's that little bit of communication that helps unwind this. Texans are lawful citizens, and they want to protest and express their outrage over the horrific killing of George Floyd. And most of them are very, very peaceful. And our chief has always led with a servant's heart and a warrior's heart when it's the proper place. I want to echo the governor's comments on the George Floyd killing. It is horrific. The national outcry and what we're seeing echoed here in Texas is an injustice that our communities, as Eric said, are feeling deeply, as are all of us as leaders. All of this region has had tragic instances. Fort Worth had our own killing of a Tatiana Jefferson just 7 months ago. That was tragic. Our community is still hurting, still reeling. Much hard work has gone into that, but nothing more than listening and compassion, where Texans can hear us and know that someone cares. And I think that helps get the healing further along than nearly anything. The protests and the demonstrations that we've seen in Fort Worth are about people exercising their First Amendment rights. I applaud the young men and women who have courageously and respectfully been involved in those protests. It's not just Fort Worth residents. As you said, Eric, many of them are outside of our region who have here. Our DPS resources, National Guard that you've made available, while we haven't called them in, they've stood ready, and we know exactly where they are if we do have to. But they're there to help resist that people who want to incite violence. Our communities of color deserve to be heard, and their message deserves to resonate with all of us, a collective compassion. I look forward to continuing this hard work with you, Governor Abbott, and with you, Mayor Johnson, along with all our communities. And I know that as an end result, peaceful demonstrations, the right to express your First Amendment, we all come together, listen, and care. Fort Worth, Dallas region, and indeed the entire state of Texas will be stronger for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mayor. And we will be happy to take some questions. I want you to know that as you ask questions, you're free to also ask questions of those who did not speak right now. One reason why these folks are here with us is because they bring their own unique information base that they can share information with you, so feel free to ask questions of them also.
Governor, you said...
So we will not be asking the United States military to come into the state of Texas because we know that Texans can take care of Texans. We have tremendous police forces in Dallas, in Fort Worth, in the surrounding suburbs, across the entire state. We have an abundance of resources that are being provided by the Texas Department of Public Safety. They've deployed something around close to 3,000 people across the entire state of Texas already. We have the National Guard that's adding people by the day to make sure that we are going to be capable of making sure Texans will be able to take care of Texans. Say it again now. Sure. So what happens actually on a weekly basis, sometimes twice a week, is the governors across the United States have a telephone conference with the president. Typically, it has been focusing on the coronavirus. Yesterday, it focused on what was going on across the entire country in response to what happened with regard to George Floyd. Appropriately, we all talked about the horrific killing of George Floyd and the necessity to respond to the tragedy of George Floyd in a positive way to make sure that we can provide some sense of justice, not just for George Floyd, but for every community across the United States of America. But at the same time, we talked about the necessity of restoring calm and order and safety in our communities.
You said that justice, fairness, and equality are required to move forward. Give us some examples. What are you prepared to do? What policy changes, legislative changes are you prepared to support to address the protesters' concerns?
So during my remarks, I talked about several of the laws that Texas has passed, including during the time that I have been governor. But it's just a sampling, not a complete listing of those laws. Before I came here today, I had the opportunity to visit with legislators, and I talked to them about the beginning of this process. And that is, I talked about the need for us to ensure the safety of our communities now, while we also ensure the ability of those to peacefully protest. But I also let them know that today is not going to be any type of end. For us as legislators, today is going to be the beginning of Today is going to be the beginning of a dialogue that we have among the members in the Texas Capitol to focus on issues like this, understanding that in order for us to get information that is needed to start crafting legislation begins not in January when we meet for session, but begins now as we start that process.
Is there an idea you like from any legislator so far? I've seen a lot of different ideas out there.
We're open to putting everything on the table and working toward positive solutions that will improve Texas. So first, with regard to the panels, you're probably referring to panels that we had in the aftermath of shootings, whether it be at Santa Fe or in El Paso and things like that. And we were able to have those at a time when we didn't have COVID-19. And so because of COVID-19, we have to be cautious about the way that any type of panel would be handled. However, as I laid out this morning, as I spoke with legislators, the time to start working collaboratively together begins now. With regard to your other question about, forget exactly how you worded it, but with
as far as the state conducting its own investigation into people coming from outside of Texas.
Sure. Those are ongoing. I would like to have Director McCraw answer that question, as he is the one with the most information about it. You see if that works.
Go. This work? Absolutely. Okay. Texas Rangers, special agents with DPS, are working with their counterparts, special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The construct, and certainly the U.S. Attorney is well aware of, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, to pursue all agitators and individuals that have been involved in inciting riots or looting in the state of Texas. And I can tell you, and it's already been said, the governor said it, the majority of people that are protesting are doing it because they're sickened by the murder of George Floyd, period. Absolutely. And they got a constitutional right to protest and do it peacefully. And we have an obligation as law enforcement officers to protect their right to protest and allow that to occur. However, those that engage in crime, and we're talking about there's violent extremists, okay, there's anarchists, there's Antifa, but there's also criminals, okay, that are using this as an opportunity to exploit, to loot, and hurt others. That's happening. And we've got a long memory. We've recorded evidence, and we'll continue to investigate each and every event to identify those individuals who are involved in criminal conduct and make the appropriate arrest based on probable cause and getting prosecution either the district attorneys or from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Well, everyone that's been identified thus far, yes, there's a list. No. We'll go through the normal process and due process in terms of developing reasonable suspicion, probable cause. And I can tell you, I don't mind advertising this. We do have special agents embedded trying to identify criminals that are leveraging these or are using this as an opportunity, exploiting these demonstrations, and identify them. And we've already identified some of them, and we will be arresting them, but not at this particular moment. They're all over the place. I can tell you the majority are going to be statewide, but there are individuals that have been indicated that came from out of state into, and we were even aware of in terms of May 31st, the protest and looting of Target in Austin. Okay, that was done and organized by an Antifa webpage, and of course the surveillance that was provided over the internet to identifying where law enforcement resources were staged was done over Antifa accounts. So there's no question that there is involvement of these violent extremists that are trying to exploit these things. But the majority of people that are protesting are doing it for the lawful reasons, period. They're doing it. There's evidence of Antifa, yes. And keep in mind, Antifa is a loosely knit group, right? There's not a hierarchical infrastructure. And so they self-identify. And so it's the same people that you've seen before in some of these protests, and they're more often involved in these counter-protests, are the same individuals that are involved right now using this as an opportunity. They just can't help themselves. And they're going to exploit this as much as they can.
Well, again, that would be a question best answered by police officers, and I will allow Director McCraw to answer first, and then if they want to, the police chiefs can also answer.
Make no mistake about it. There's not a police officer in Texas who's not sickened by the murder of George Floyd. I guarantee you that. I said, we get paid. You entrust us. The public can trust with so much power in police. The power to detain and unfortunately to use force at times. And with that trust, we're to use it for one reason, that's to protect people, not to harm people. And that's exactly what he was harmed, okay? He was murdered, and it's unacceptable. And every officer is accountable for their actions. And as the governor pointed out, video cameras on every one of our troopers and police officers are wearing those around because that's evidence, okay, to ensure that there is evidence that captures what they're doing in their interactions with the public. Because we've got a responsibility and a right, an obligation to treat everyone with dignity and respect. You know, what did you talk about, deadly violence or deadly force? Well, quite frankly, that is run by, there's a lot of that is case law by the Supreme Court. We've got an obligation to ensure that we're in complete compliance with it and a strict compliance. But the bottom line is, there's not a police officer, the use of force should be the last resort, okay? Everything you try to do with your gear around is the force continuum is to try to de-escalate it from the beginning. And you don't want to get to that last part. But there are times, and only times, when you're in imminent fear of your safety or the safety of others, are you allowed to use deadly force, and it has to be reasonable in the way you use deadly force. I'll let the legislators and policymakers make that decision. Bottom line is that we should never use force unless we absolutely have to save lives.
Ron, let me ask you about, you mentioned Antifa. Can you tell us, are white supremacist groups operating in Texas to your knowledge?
Yeah, there are. But they're always operating, and they certainly would leverage advantage of it. We've had reports that they are. We haven't seen that yet. I've yet actually seen reports of Boogaloo and other groups that sometimes have a Nazi affiliation. But hey, they're thugs. Okay, they're criminals. Okay, they're racists. They're bigots. They'll be involved in some way, shape, or form in some criminal activity trying to exploit this, if nothing else, counter-protesting or pitting someone against another.
Well, so there are going to be ideas like that come forward, and I think it's important that we have the opportunity to be able to have dialogue with all legislators and round out the completeness of all these issues, consider the pros and cons and modifications to any of these issues. And so one-off answers are incomplete. We need to have the complete dialogue of everybody in the House and Senate.
Last question.
Would you reset your question, please? There has been no request for Texas to send National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. I do not expect that request. Texas National Guard are here for Texans, and that's exactly what they will be used for.
Thanks, guys. Thank you all.
Real quick.
Well, I don't want to concentrate on actions that I took. The action or the discussion needs to remain on the murder of George Floyd and the understandable outrage of the community and the peaceful protests that we are supporting. As the governor said and the mayor said, we can't have that anarchist vandalism and looting and certainly not assaultive behavior. But we're here to support the peaceful protests as much as we can, and that's a concentration of what we're doing, and that's, I think, where the conversation needs to be. I do think, and I've seen other police in other communities kneeling and marching in solidarity and having these tough conversations with members of the protest, and I think that's definitely a step in the right direction. I've said it before, that we have to come together with our communities, and the first step, it's incumbent on us, the police, to take it. We cannot expect the community to come to us if we're not willing to go to them first.
Chief, if you ask for additional resources. Chief, I really need you to speak into the microphone.
Sorry. So I've been in contact with our divisional representative of the Texas DPS, who has offered all the resources that we could need. My goal is to handle this with Fort Worth police officers who are embedded in the community, familiar with the community, and that I am confident will deal with the community in a very good way.
I think Chief Hall is answering next.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What was the question? You said, are we expected to honor? Yes. Local curfews. Yes, absolutely. We are putting these curfews in place to keep the peaceful protesters as well as our community, our businesses, keep everyone safe. And we're just asking that they would abide by those curfews.
Chief Hall, we saw the bridge last night. Should the curfew area be extended?
If we have additional questions from police officers, they'll stick around, but the governor's on schedule, the mayors are on schedule, so we got to do it. So you guys have additional questions for the chief, more than happy to stick around and take those questions. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Governor.
You've been listening to Governor Greg Abbott as well as leaders from Dallas and Fort Worth and the DPS talk about the situation across the state with the protests. The governor saying that George Floyd's death has touched everyone in every corner of this country, and it is important that we not overshadow his death and instead shine a light. And that means getting together right now to formulate legislation and not waiting for lawmakers to get back together. It is important that even the cities themselves get together. You also heard mentioned probably the biggest thing coming out of this meeting today was the DPS Director Colonel Steve McCraw specifically talking about the Target looting that happened in Austin this past weekend and saying that it was in fact organized by Antifa. That is that